We are now joined by Hemindra Hazari. Thank you very much, Hemindra, for being with us here on NDTV Profit. So the new norms have finally come through. A lot of articles, a lot of reports indicating that they are better than what the draft guidelines really were. How do you really look at the new guidelines that have come through?
So I think it is better because earlier the apprehension was that since many loans are linked to the base rate, and if the banks were to reduce their base rate based on marginal cost of funding, a significant part of their loan portfolio would get repriced lower. Now this guideline has introduced this concepts of, they can have a tenure-linked marginal cost of based lending rate. So this has given the banking industry more time and a longer period to adjust to this new situation. And therefore, as compared to the earlier draft guideline, this is much better for the banking industry. It was also realized that, as we have moved on, if you look at the bank's average cost of funding, it is very now close anyway to the marginal cost of funding. For example, if you see SBI, its average cost of funding is about 6.3%, while its 1 year retail deposit rate is 7%. And if you go to, from the 46-day to the 1 year, it ranges from 5.25 to 7%. So at least in the case of SBI, you will notice, and this would be very similar to other banks as well, that there is not that much difference today between the marginal cost of funding and the average cost of funding. Plus, you have this now tenure link, so it will ease the problem for the banking industry.
Right. It's sounding as if it's certainly something that's going to help the banks eventually as well. If you could help our viewers understand, the kind of spread, the kind of options that have been given by RBI, or rather, the way this entire formula will be calculated now, the way banks will come out with the final lending rate, what all components are going to be a part of it, and what's going to be the significance of all of them?
The banks will now base on their marginal cost of funding, which I said, let's take in the case of SBI. In SBI's case, their 1 year and below rate from the least to the retail depositors goes between 5.25 to 7%. And that today the average cost of funding, at least till the second quarter, was 6.3%. So therefore, it is safe to assume that their marginal cost of funding will be lower than 7%. That too, because SBI also has significant current and savings account deposits. Now, if we assume that their marginal cost of deposits would be less than 7%, then it follows that their base rate would have a certain spread over that, to make up for the salaries and other expenses that go into it. Plus, there will be a spread that SBI will give for each borrower. And here also the banks will have leeway, to increase the spread in a downward interest rate cycle so as to protect their margins. So therefore, I really do not see for the final borrower their cost of borrowings coming significantly below, because banks traditionally have been very reluctant in a downward interest rate cycle to pass on the full benefits to borrowers, while in an upward interest rate cycle, they're extremely eager to increase interest rates, and that by and large will remain. You must also remember today that the net interest margin for banks is about 300 to 325 basis points in the industry. Now, this is extremely necessary because there is a significant part of non-yielding, non-performing loans. So if you take the visible and disclosed estimate of about 10%, but in my view, you have to take about 25 to 30% of all loans today are not earning the bank's interest. So they have to compensate for this very significant part of their loan portfolio, which is not yielding them interest. Therefore, that spread is required. And I really do not see banks, implementing strategies which will reduce their margin at such a stage, because this type of profit is extremely necessary given the acute asset quality pressures they are currently under.
Right. So what I can essentially understand with what you've explained to us is that nothing much really is going to change as far as the customer really is concerned when it comes to the borrower. The new borrowers will be coming in post 1st April 2016. And for the banks as well, they have already been, pretty much closer to the final rate that we are going to see after they adopt the marginal cost of funding formula, right?
Yes, I really do not see a very significant change. Of course, those quality borrowers will continue to pressure banks, as they have done so even earlier, to lower their rate of interest. And that pressure will continue. But it has to be borne in mind that today there are very, very few quality borrowers out there because of the stresses that are there in the Indian economy and particularly in the corporate sector. So there are very few borrowers really who are paying interest on time today. So that pressure that the banks talk about, I really do not see being very significant from the profit point of view.
Then what really changes, Hemindra? I mean, then what's really the point to get into this and, make things so complicated? What is really the objective probably that, that everyone's really trying to achieve with this new formula by getting this formula in place?
See, earlier, the objective was for transmitting RBI's monetary policy. And when the RBI realized that banks, even after its first guideline, were extremely reluctant to implement such a strategy, I believe this has come as some type of face-saving device by the RBI to say that, yes, now we've introduced this and, there's going to be some change and transmission of monetary policy will take place. But on the ground, I really do not see anything material coming in. So it is just like, to satisfy the public that, yes, the RBI is doing something. But for the final borrower, I really do not see any significant difference. And that is really because the banking industry today is under severe pressure from non-performing loans. And therefore, no entity, no profit, objective entity will see that their profits are reduced in such a situation.
Right. So eventually there'll be transparency in terms of, how banks evaluate or calculate their base rate. So a better transmission. But we also understand that this is only going to benefit those who have got or who will take a floating rate, which is not really the case with many of the banks, as most of the book is into fixed rate, right?
That is correct. So what this RBI guideline says that incrementally, at least from 1st April onwards, all new loans or all loans which are coming up for renewal will have a tenure linked to it. So from there on, the change will come in. But, banks will always make sure at that point in time that their margins are protected. And if the bulk of the banking sector borrowers were extremely quality conscious or were quality borrowers, then I could expect some, compression in the margin because their bargaining power would have increased vis-a-vis the banks. But as I said earlier, in this economic environment, there are very few quality borrowers out there who can exert such pressure, on the banks.
All right, Hemindra, we'll leave it there. But appreciate you joining us here on NDTV Profit and helping us viewers understand this new methodology that banks will now be adopting to calculate their base rate.